Thank you for joining us for Living the Promise, a Catholic marriage enrichment series created by the Archdiocese of Los Angeles Office of Marriage and Family Life. Guiding this session on married spirituality are Deacon Tom and Pat Hallowell. They have been married for over 40 years and have 2 children and 5 grandchildren. They will be sharing their faith journey and providing valuable information and tools that will help you build a faith-filled, loving marriage with God as your center.
Spirituality is the foundation of our marriage today. Our married spirituality is what guides and directs us as a married couple. However, we didn't know this when we were first married.
Like the prodigal son of the Bible, we wandered, we struggled. We came back and God ran to meet us, welcomed us back, and blessed us. Each couple in their early years is light years ahead in their spiritual journey than we were when we got married.
Well, we were married when we were 22 years old. I had a previous marriage that was in the annulment process. I had been raised Catholic, attended Catholic schools, but the faith that had burned bright in me as a child began to flicker on and off as I grew into adolescence and young adulthood. Well, when I met Tom, my faith was dormant, and when we were married, I was content with being married by a minister in the park, but had no firm ties to a parish community.
I didn't see faith as a very important part of marriage. In my family of origin, I was brought up in the Catholic faith, but there was a lot of divorce in my family, and I didn't see the connection between God and marriage. I knew I didn't want my marriage to end in divorce, but I didn't know how important God was to having a successful marriage. I viewed our marriage as being about me. I married Pat because I thought it was a good idea for me. I didn't have any real concept of what it meant to be selfless or to give to another. I was like a sponge that was content to take love and attention from Pat without realizing that I needed to give her love and attention as well.
Well, I was trying to get used to my new role of being a wife and then shortly afterward the role of mother. And I was feeling overwhelmed. Even though we went to church off and on, I too didn't see God as a big part of our marriage.
After about 3 years, our marriage began to struggle. My me-first approach was not working. Pat and I were growing apart, and I found myself feeling alone and desperate. I realized I needed to become someone different. It was at that time that I saw an angel. In college, I met a good friend named Jack. He wasn't an angel yet, but during this time, he found Christ and his life changed. I didn't. Shortly after Pat and I were married, Jack and I lost touch. During this time of struggle in our marriage, I walked into work one day and there was Jack. The person who worked in the department began introducing us. Tom, I'd like you to meet. And I cried out, Jack. At the same time, he cried out, Tom. Today, I believe that God placed Jack in that place at that time to save me, to save us, to save our children, and now our grandchildren. That is why I think of Jack as an angel. We started going to lunch together each day, talking about the role that God could have in my life. Then we began reading the Bible and discussing God's teachings. For the first time, I began to see Jesus' life, death, and resurrection as the ultimate act of sacrificial love, and began to think about what my life might be like if I learned to love in that way. Jack invited us to Easter services at his church, which was a Protestant church. It hit. I felt like we were home. We began attending church and felt very welcome there and began to grow as individuals and as a couple. Today, Jack is my best friend, and we still share our lives and how God continues to work in them. It was during this process that I began to see that God could have a role in our marriage, and that God would bless us, and we could prosper in our marriage if we would invite God to become an integral part of it. I continued to grow in my understanding of sacrificial love, and to understand that my needs would only be met when I was more concerned about meeting Pat's needs than my own.
I had my own angel story, and a few months after we began this step in our faith journey, I came upon a Catholic church in Long Beach. I was driving on the freeway for a work task, and the car began to run rough. A man in the next lane signaled that my tire was flat. I got off on the next off-ramp and came upon St. Joseph Catholic Church in Long Beach. I used the rectory phone to call the auto club and was impressed by the kindness of the rectory staff that let me use the phone. I would later come to regard the man who signaled me to exit at this very spot, at this very time, as a gift from God. An angel in my eyes. Oh, my goodness. If the man has hesitated in warning me just 1/4 mile later, there was another exit that would have put me on the same street, but in the opposite direction. That day was the next step in a spiritual journey that would make a tremendous change in our lives and the lives of our children. Well, after going to St. Joseph's, I felt called to go to Mass there. I'd gone to a grammar school at a parish with the same name, and I think that finding this church reminded me about the beauty and purity of practicing my faith as a child. I began to long for that time of simplicity and the love that I had for my faith that I had forgotten. I decided I was going to attend and take the children, hoping that Tom would join us.
I didn't want to return to the Catholic Church. When we had attended other Catholic churches earlier in our marriage, we didn't feel welcome, and I never felt like we fit in. At the same time, Pat was firm that she was going to try St. Joseph and would be taking our children with or without me. So grudgingly, I agreed to go with them.
That Sunday, the pastor read the announcement, which seemed like a message directed specifically to us. There was a Bible study that was starting the next week, and Tom and I looked at each other and we smiled because we had really enjoyed the Bible study program at the other church. And there was also a co-op babysitting program, so we could share the Mass and Bible study without distractions, knowing that our children would be cared for. The next step of my adult conversion process was to accept the beautiful Catholic faith that had been given to me by my parents as a child, but that I didn't fully embrace until I faced the challenges of being a wife and mother. I started to feel stronger and more committed to our marriage.
We met a young priest at St. Joseph. In the process of getting to know us, he invited us to get married in the Catholic Church. I asked why, since we're already married. He told us that we would be inviting Christ into our marriage. How could I say no to that?
Well, by this time, my annulment had been granted, and we were married in the Catholic Church later that year. Once we did this, our lives began to change even more. It wasn't overnight, but it was a journey and a process over time. We began to regularly attend Mass, and our faith began to grow, and our marriage became more God-centered.
Pope Paul VI first introduced the concept of the family being a domestic sanctuary, or domestic church. Pope John Paul II further expanded on this by saying, "The Christian family constitutes a specific revelation and realization of ecclesial communion, and for this reason it can and should be called the domestic church." In saying this, John Paul II gives the family a theologically elevated position, as an explicit church in miniature, where sacraments are lived out. Let's rejoin Pat and Tom as they talk about their experience of their own domestic church, which they lovingly refer to as their little church of the family.
We began to understand that it wasn't all about ourselves and our individual needs, rather it was about each other's needs. And our little church, that is the little church of our family and God's presence within our family. We became involved in the church community, and our children later attended parish school. We began to pray with our children regularly at meals, at home, and as well as in restaurants and at bedtime. We became a part of a group that made sack lunches for the homeless and delivered food baskets to needy families. We began to live out our faith. Our children were part of this ministry. It became our primary ministry, and it really impacted our children. They both grew up to have a heart for the homeless, and both chose professions where they help others. We were now united and life-giving and supporting each other in our spiritual journey, with our goal of helping each other to get to heaven. This year, we're taking our grandson with us to deliver food baskets to a needy family, and with our son and his wife, are passing the tradition on to the next generation.
The call to become a deacon was one that took many years to grow within me. Over maybe a 10-year period, when I would go to Mass, sometimes I could envision myself on the altar, and other times I couldn't. One day our pastor asked us if we would like to begin the deacon formation process. I gotta tell you, I wasn't really sure I saw myself in that role. Shortly after that, we celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary at St. Joseph and invited all of our family and friends. I remember telling our story at the end of Mass, the story we have just told now. After the celebration, we opened cards and gifts, and some of the cards were from young people who thanked us for being role models for them. I did see us as role models for some young people, but not the ones who gave us those cards. I was surprised because I never thought we had impacted the people who saw us as role models. We never anticipated having this kind of effect on others. We began to see that God was using us in ways we were not aware of.
There have been times in our lives that I saw very clearly that Tom was being guided by the Holy Spirit, and this was one of those times. Initially, I was reluctant, as I was pursuing my dream of going back to college to complete my college education. I didn't see how I could work full-time, complete a college course each semester, and handle the workload required to complete the diaconate formation process at the same time. We talked it over, and Tom suggested a resolution, and God opened doors for us along the journey to make it a reality. I quit my full-time job, I enrolled at a university full-time, and we started the diaconate program. The road was not easy for either one of us, but with God's guidance and abundant graces, we both achieved our goals. 5 years later, I completed my education and began a new career. Tom was ordained a deacon.
During the deacon formation process, I found myself asking God, why did you pick me for this? I've made so many mistakes. You could have picked someone else who wasn't so wounded. The answer that came to me was, Tom, I chose you because you're so wounded.
We choose to be involved in a marriage ministry because we know firsthand what an incredible difference it makes when a couple invites Christ into their marriage. We choose to surround ourselves with other couples that have God-centered marriages, many of whom we met going to a marriage encounter weekend. We have come to realize the sacredness of our marriage and began to treat our relationship with the respect and commitment that God intended for us.
Forgiveness and reconciliation are essential to living out God's plan for you as a married couple. When a couple holds on to hurt, pain, resentment, and anger, it harms their relationship. Forgiveness helps you to live in the present and fulfill God's call to unconditional love. Pat and Tom are now going to share with you the importance of forgiveness in their lives.
We see our family as a little church that strengthens, fortifies, and spreads goodness to their universal church and to the world. This is where we learn patience, love, and respect, as well as to ask for and grant forgiveness.
We've learned that forgiveness is an essential aspect in a marriage. It's important to be respectful and loving as we ask for or grant forgiveness. We know that we all need to seek forgiveness at some time. We will offend, disappoint, or hurt the feelings of one another from time to time. The sacrament of marriage gives us the grace of forgiveness to love and to turn disappointment into healing and growth as a couple.
When I say I'm sorry, it's an easy and convenient act of getting myself off the hook. It doesn't require a response, so there may not be a resolution except in the mind of the speaker.
On the other hand, when I ask for forgiveness, it's a graced act of our God-given conscience, a two-way action in which both spouses must be involved. One person must choose to ask for forgiveness, and the other person must choose to grant forgiveness.
We are imperfect people and we make mistakes and hurt each other. But the growth we can attain that allows us to forgive and accept forgiveness is tremendous. I had to learn to grant unconditional forgiveness without allowing the hurt to rear its ugly head again and to show the same love God shows us. With God as our example, we gain the courage and purpose to move forward and make the decision to love by either asking for or freely giving forgiveness. The fruit of this is that our relationship becomes more intimate. With God as our example, we gain the courage and purpose to move forward and make the decision to love by either asking for or freely giving forgiveness. The fruit of this is that our relationship becomes more intimate. Many times it's the little disputes that likely point to an area where we need to grow. Recently, I came home on a Friday from work and I felt drained. When we asked each other how our days had gone, I shared what a difficult day it had been.
Well, I didn't listen to Pat with any sense of empathy, and I made no attempt to understand her needs. Instead, I shared about my bike ride and nap and was ready to head out the door. If you would have asked me what Pat said, I could have repeated it to you, but what Pat shared never got past my head and into my heart.
We only had a few minutes at home before we left for a scheduled activity that was just 20 minutes down the freeway. When we got in the car, I suggested we change the music from Pandora to a radio station I enjoy.
Immediately, I launched into an offensive where I said I abhor the radio because of the commercials and asked, why can't we just listen to a Pandora station?
I had been longing for 20 minutes of peace, and I felt as if my opportunity for peace vanished when we got into an argument over what to listen to. I know this sounds like a minor incident, but the fact that we had to argue over what I considered a minor request made me feel even more drained, and it made me feel belittled.
When we were driving and discussing which music we would listen to, we went back and forth, and from my perspective, we were trying to work out a suitable arrangement. I saw this as a constructive dialogue, trying to work out an agreement we both could live with. I didn't appreciate the effect Pat's day had on her, and I didn't pay attention as she became more upset.
What Tom saw as a constructive dialogue, I saw as a negotiation. I thought, I'm not your client, I'm your wife.
When I realized that what I saw as constructive, Pat saw as very hurtful, I immediately asked for her forgiveness. I felt regret for not having really listened to Pat. I realized I had completely overlooked what she had told me about her day. I felt upset at myself for hurting her. It wasn't difficult for me to ask for forgiveness. I tend to get wound up, come on much stronger than I'm aware of, cool down, forget it, and move on. However, I felt frustrated for taking what should have been a short, simple discussion and making it a painful event for Pat. It created distance between us, and I felt angry at myself for allowing this to happen.
When Tom asked for forgiveness, at first it was hard to accept. Was this just words or was there meaning behind it? But later, when we had more time to talk and I reevaluated my response, I realized I needed to make an adjustment to my schedule to create more downtime, more leisure time for me. I realized that I had allowed the stress from my day to come between us. I needed to forgive Tom and move on. Holding on to anger would only hurt us both. Tom suggested we take a dance class together during the week. This suggestion was a real act of love because I know that Tom doesn't like to dance, but I do. Tom's suggestion motivated me to sign up for a dance class to add a leisure activity that we could share together and help reduce the stress in my life. We've gone to a couple of classes and are both motivated to sign up for another class because we're enjoying it and getting good exercise. We were able to get from hurt to healing and are now experiencing the joy of the journey.
We're human, and hurting each other is inevitable. However, if we open up to each other and work together to heal the hurt, we can come out of it more connected than we were before. It isn't comfortable, it won't feel good, but it's necessary to build a healthy relationship. Falling out of like is normal. Working on finding that like again is part of marriage. We use the grace we received from our sacrament of matrimony to enable us to work through the difficult times. It's important to remember that God wants us to have fun and joy in our married life. Our task is to respond to God's call by staying, emotionally and literally, staying and doing the work. The saddest thing would be to leave before the miracle happens. Stay and get there. On the day of our sacramental marriage, we made a covenant promise to each other and to God.
We ask God daily to be a part of our marriage and to strengthen and bless us with His grace. We have the gift of being able to call on this grace to love each other unconditionally and help each other get to heaven.
All of us have the opportunity and the call to work for God. We've been sent to share with others our story, our lessons, and our experiences of God in our sacramental marriage.
Marriage isn't always easy. You have to work at it. But when God is at the center, the payout is so great.
Tom and Pat just shared their personal journey, which strengthened their love of God and helped them to nurture each other and their little church of the family. As couples, we too are called to live our own spiritual journey with God, with each other, and with His people. Having God as the focus of our lives will keep us always on the path to His heavenly kingdom. Thank you to Tom and Pat for sharing your spiritual journey.